Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So today my talk is hydrophobic organic compounds in Pennsylvania groundwater do not show influence of deep shale brines, and today I'll tell you why we think that is, and I'll also show you some other relationships that we found over the course of this study. So as we all know, Marcellus shale development is just booming in recent years, especially in the state of Pennsylvania. Over the course of the past 7.5 years, over 23,000 gas wells have become active throughout the state. And a lot of this development is focused in the northeastern portion of Pennsylvania with a lot of unconventional wells that have gone in. And because of that heavy development, it's a great area to study groundwater chemistry and changes due to this industrial practice. So over the course of 3 sampling campaigns, we went to Susquehanna, Bradford, and Wayne counties, and we collected groundwater samples from private homeowner wells. Here in this figure, you're looking at our sample sites. So the orange triangles are the sample sites we collected in May of 2012, and the orange dots are the shale gas wells that existed at the time of sampling. And then when we went back in July of 2013, those are the triangles in yellow, and the yellow dots are the gas wells that became active since we were there the last time. And we also went back in June of this past summer, and we collected a few more samples, and you can see those in the blue triangles there. Our goal was to create a comprehensive hydrophobic organic compound data set for this area, because there really isn't one that looks at purgeable organic compounds, gasoline range organic compounds, and diesel range organic compounds. So we collected our samples in these pre-combusted VOA vials with no headspace. You'll see a nice methane bubble that's developed after the samples were collected. And our targeted analysis focused on purgeable organic compounds, including BTEX compounds and disinfection byproducts and a host of others. And we also did a non-targeted analysis to look for gasoline range organic compounds and diesel range organic compounds. Now, GRO are those low boiling point compounds that pretty much encompass most of the purgeable organic compounds in the VOCs. So those analyses were done in tandem on all of our samples. And we also looked for those more semi-volatile compounds in our non-targeted analysis in diesel range organic compounds. So only a subset of the total samples were analyzed for DRO, and that's just because of time and resource constraints with liquid extractions. But one thing that I need to note that our lab is really good at doing is getting low detection limits. We can get our non-targeted analysis detection limits down to about 1 part per billion, which is crucial in this type of work when we're looking at trace organic compounds in groundwater. So we did find some hydrocarbons in the groundwater, and our first goal was to try and find out where they came from. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the study that came out in 2012 from a group at Duke that basically characterized shallow groundwater from the same geographical area based on inorganic constituents, and they concluded that this type D water was representative of shallow groundwater that had naturally mixed with formation brines through natural pathways, and we wanted to see if there was any correlation with our GRO and DRO and that water type. And it turns out we didn't see any statistical differences between GRO and DRO and that water type. So that's telling us that these formation brines that are naturally migrating upward likely aren't carrying these organic compounds with them. And then we did our spatial data analysis, and you've seen these figures over and over again for methane data and some metals in the Barnett Shale. And here you're looking at GRO and DRO and their concentrations plotted on the y-axis and the distance from the nearest shale gas well on the x-axis. For gasoline range organic compounds, we didn't see any statistical correlation between concentration and distance. However, for DRO, we did see a statistically significant negative correlation for concentration and distance. This is telling us that for our particular data set, the closer you are to a shale gas well, you're more likely to have diesel range organic compounds in your groundwater. And furthermore, looking at a black and white comparison of an active zone and a non-active zone delineated as a 1 kilometer radius from a gas well, we see that there's no statistical difference between GRO. However, we do see that difference again with DRO. And in fact, the average concentration of DRO in groundwater in an active zone was around 18 parts per billion, and further away than a kilometer in the non-active zone, it was around 1.5 parts per billion. When we look at the GRO and DRO plotted against one another that came from the exact same sample, we see that there's really two different populations here, and we didn't expect this. We're not seeing higher or elevated GRO corresponding with elevated levels of DRO. And we're trying to ask ourselves why we're seeing these relationships. And we're really focused on this DRO because the concentrations are relatively greater than they are for GRO, upwards of 150 parts per billion. So we're asking ourselves, well, why can we see this elevated DRO signature with a lower GRO signature? And then we're proposing these transport mechanisms like we've all seen in these diagrams. And the first we talked about was upward migration of hydraulic fracturing fluids or formation waters. And if we were to see this, we would likely note higher GRO in our samples with either high or low DRO, depending on the time frame. And we would see that salt correlation that I told you we didn't see with a type D water. So we don't think this is the particular mechanism for these hydrophobic organic compounds getting in the groundwater. And then we talked about well casing failures. And we know that well cases do fail. And if we were to see these organic compounds in the groundwater because of it, we would again note the elevated GRO corresponding with elevated DRO. And we wouldn't necessarily have a salt correlation. But because we don't have those elevated GRO signatures in our samples with a higher DRO, we don't think that's the reason either. And we talked about containment pits that hold wastes. And we know containment pits do leak over time if they're not lined properly. And they're really meant to gas off these volatile compounds and settle others. So we would notice a low GRO signature in our samples that could correspond with a higher DRO. But we would also see that salt correlation because we know that the wastes are highly saline. And we're not seeing those correlations, so we also don't think that's the reason. And that leads us to surface spills of fluids or muds on site, either during storage or handling or transportation. And if we were to see the signature coming from surface spills, we could notice low GRO as those compounds are gassing off to the atmosphere and elevated DRO if they're leaching into the groundwater, and we wouldn't necessarily see a salt correlation. So we asked ourselves, are there any particular compounds that stand out in our liquid-liquid extracts that can point us further in this direction? So we sent a subset of them out for a two-dimensional GC analysis, and some of the interesting results are shown here. The 6 samples are identical in both panes, and here we're looking at 2 groups of compounds we pulled out that definitely aren't geogenic and stood out to us as maybe coming from this particular mechanism. And the first is this siloxane group with the M/Z of 73, and it was detected in 4 out of our 6 samples that we sent away. And the other group on the right is the phthalate group of an M/Z 149, and that was detected in 2 of the 6 samples we sent. And what's interesting is this sample that's outlined in yellow here is the salt spring in Susquehanna County that's naturally high in methane and high in salts, and we think it's more of the natural background of the area. And we don't see either of these compounds in that salt spring sample. And we know that siloxanes and phthalates are ubiquitous in industrial applications, and however, we do know that they are additives in hydraulic fracturing fluid, so we definitely can't rule that out. And furthermore, when we look at accidental releases of fluids or muds or wastes into the environment, this figure here is the same one that I showed you earlier. However, this time we're looking at release incidences as reported by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And you can see that accidental releases do occur, and they're actually quite widespread throughout the state. If you compare the 10,000 or so unconventional gas wells in the state of Pennsylvania and the 2,600 release incidences that were reported for unconventional gas operations, that's around a 26% failure rate when we look at it in those 2 direct comparisons. So just a quick conclusion from the study, we did see that we had siloxane and phthalate detections that really trace levels, and we know that they're ubiquitous in industrial applications. However, they are known fracking fluid additives. We saw the elevated DRO signature closer to shale gas wells and not necessarily a correlation with that shale brine migration. And we didn't see the same correlations with GRO, and we can likely attribute this to release incidences. as 26% of unconventional gas operations have reported a release in the past few years. And this can definitely increase the risks for groundwater contamination in this particular study area. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone that's helped me out over the past couple of years in my funding sources, and I would gladly take any questions with my remaining time. Thank you.
Thank you. We have several minutes for questions. So any questions from the audience? Go on, Nick, you first.
Sure.
Question. So you said that the reportable instances come from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection.
Correct.
Do you have some either hard or colloquial evidence for the amount of instances that do not go reported to the Pennsylvania DEP and therefore are not accounted for in that?
Yeah, so the question was, is there a number out there of release incidences that aren't reported to the DEP? And unfortunately, I don't have that number. So I can imagine this number that we have that I showed on the plot is the minimum of the minimum amount of reported releases in the past few years. So unfortunately, I don't have that number.
So those that are reported to the state, they're required to, I imagine, disclose the volume of liquids that would spill? You
would think so, but no. So if you look at the database for the releases, it's very sparse. One thing for certain is the location and the well operator. However, the types of fluids that were spilled and the amounts are very vague, and it's not consistent throughout the entire database. You don't really know how much was released in every particular area.
So do you know if it's a minimum volume that they need, what they have to report it, or they should report it if it's above a minimum volume, and is there any sort of guidelines from the state on that?
I don't know if there's a minimum number. No, I don't.
Is the state taking any action in order to improve the environmental stewardship in this case?
One thing you'll notice on the database is sometimes you'll see the fines that were imposed on the particular company if they had a release. However, as we often know, the higher and more enforced the fines are, you might not necessarily get these voluntarily reported releases. So as far as improved technologies and best management practices going forward, I haven't seen any information that would indicate that that's being improved right now.
Any other questions? All right, we are a few minutes ahead of schedule.
I have one more.
Sure.
In the database, is there also information on what led to the release, the type of release, the mechanism? And if there is, do you have a recommendation on improvement of best practices for what field operations are at these well sites?
Sometimes there is a specific line that says like 5 barrels were mishandled when a hose fell off a truck. But most of the time it just says there's an accidental release of fluids to the Commonwealth of the state of Pennsylvania. And that's as vague as they get. So to answer your question, I don't think they're as specific as they should be to figure out what needs to be done to fix the problem.